Why, hello everybody. We're back together again. So welcome to the Aviation Show, brought to you as always by the Pima Air and Space Museum. And we have the fabulous Joe Wilding with us. And we're in Sussex. And we're inside because it's raining. So yeah, welcome to... Oh no, the sun is out. We should go outside and do
probably a good rainbow.
Joe, we've done the Century series. We've done the F4. We even did the F101 Voodoo because everybody got upset about that. What are we here at the Tangmere Aviation Museum, just outside Chichester, to talk about this time?
We're going to talk about the evolution of early British jets, and I promise I will play nice. As an American, I promise. Actually, I'm a big fan of all of these aircraft, so lots to talk about.
Yes, and I think we're going to have some fun. My favorite Hunter is just behind us, so if you've not seen our little tour of Tangmere, do check that out. And yeah, I think we'd better get started.
Yeah.
And you see, I'm holding so many bits of kit. You don't have to look at me, dear viewer. You're just you're gonna have Joe. So okay, let me just turn these cameras around and we can get going. So Joe, you say you're gonna play nice. And I was very, very good when it came to everything except the F101. And the dear commenters let us know about that. But where are we going to start with the story of British jet aircraft, first Gen 0.5, as I'm sure one or two people have called them in the past as well.
Well, so real quick, I just got a quick little anecdote I stumbled on by accident, total accident last week. There's an American connection to this airbase. I don't know if you know this or not. The famous Robin Olds, the famous jet pioneer from double ace in World War II, ace in Vietnam, pioneered a lot of early jet tactics for America. He not only was stationed here, he was a Meteor squadron commander here at this base for a year around 1948. So there was a exchange program between squadron commanders between the US and Great Britain for a bit, and he was here. So I thought that was kind of a cool little piece of history.
I did not know that, actually.
Yeah.
So this is why I bring you around.
There we go.
Cool, right. So
first of all, just to set expectations right here, I'm an engineer. We're going to talk mostly about the development of these jets and some of the technical breakthroughs that were made and or not made occasionally. We're not really going to talk about the operational history. That's like another expert on this kind of stuff. Not that I'm really an expert per se, but anyway, that's what we're mostly going to be focusing on here is how these aircraft came about, how they evolved, and some of the challenges that were solved as they progressed. So
fantastic. And they're just fixing the door. So if there's a bit of banging, dear viewer, that's what's going on.
Yeah. So this museum is fabulous because I like to talk about fighter generations. You just mentioned it. That could be a whole argument in itself of what is a fighter generation and who counts what and whatever.
We should make our own.
We should. So for this purpose today, I'm going to use the one that was proposed by Richard Havilland, the USAF historian. His tends to focus more on the early years. So he has different generations from this very first, like the Meteor, up through the Century series, and actually 4 steps, which is a lot, but I think it's very, really tells the story well. So you can argue about Gen 5, 6, whatever, pluses and so forth later. That's fine, right? For today, just for nomenclature purposes, we're going to talk about Gens 1, 2, 3, 4 per Havilland's definition. So Gen 1 is what we're going to talk about first, and we're going to talk about engines here in just a second because engines is such a key part of the story. You can't talk about the jets and the evolution without the engines. They really drove the design of this. So the Generation 1 is literally just the very first jets that were made, including the Gloster Meteor, the ME-262, the de Havilland Vampire, which is next door here. And then usually a couple more get lumped into that. It's essentially anything with a straight wing, before the wings get swept. Those are Generation 1, including a few prototypes. Yeah. So let's start by talking about the engines, because they play such a pivotal role in how these airplanes evolved. So this is a Derwent, which is a centrifugal compressor engine. We'll talk about that in just a second. This is a very similar engine to the very original engines designed by Whittle. Not exactly the same, but it's very similar. So I love that they have a cutaway here because it really explains it well. So this right here is a double-sided compressor that obviously spins. The way it works is it sucks air and actually from both directions flings it outward. As it's flung outward, technical term there. It gains pressure, and then it goes into the combustion chambers here, mixes with fuel, that ignites, that comes back. Probably can't hardly see it in there, but there's a turbine section right here that extracts the energy, some of the energy out of that. That's what powers this whole system. And then the rest of the flow that's now at high pressure, high temperature, high speed, exits out the back much, much faster than it came in. And that's how we produce thrust. So this type of an engine has some advantages. One, it was very simple to produce. It's really not much different technology than what the turbo superchargers on most of the engines at the time had. So this compressor here looks pretty much like a supercharger on the back of a Merlin or a Napier or name your engine of the time. Like the technology there is almost exactly the same. The turbine, most piston engines didn't have that, but any aircraft with a turbocharger did. So think P-47, B-17 had turbochargers with a turbine section very much like that. So it's really taking technology that was already existing and putting it together. Lots of details, of course, in there. I'm not trying to belittle what Whittle did, so to speak. Lots of details, especially on the burners, getting that all sized properly, but the actual bits and pieces were kind of known. So that's the upside of these engines. The downside, as you can see here as I stand next to this, this thing is like almost 5 feet in diameter. It's a really big engine, which you do not want big cross sections once you start making airplanes go fast.
We come around this way.
Exactly. So that ended up being a real challenge. And this engine, this specific Derwent, I don't know, probably put out 3,000 to 4,000 horsepower. The very first Power Jets, W2 I think it was called, looked about like this and was about the same size as what was in the original Meteor. I think it put out less than 2,000 pounds. So for an engine this big, only putting out 2,000 pounds, that's not much. So that's actually a fascinating story in itself. So for the very first jet engines made by Whittle and O'Hain, put out on the order of 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of thrust for a very large engine. Over the next 10 years, so-called early 40s to early 50s, jet engines gained almost 1,000 pounds of thrust per year. So if you had an airplane that just barely performed, all you had to do was like wait a year, upgrade the engine, and all of a sudden, hey, this thing now works. And better yet, you could also make airplanes a year or two later that you could not make in the previous years. So the Meteor is the perfect example of that. When this thing was first designed, there was actually a prototype precursor to this called the E-28, also made by Gloster, which I'm sure you can put a picture of. Yeah. The photographers of the era did not do that aircraft justice. The same view you always see of it makes it look like this little pig of an airplane. It was actually an amazing airplane. It was designed really well for how little of a thrust it had. And I think the original idea for that airplane was to put guns on it and actually make it into a viable fighter. But they figured out quickly that it just, with the engines at the time and the level of thrust, it just wasn't feasible.
It's in the Science Museum.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yep. But they learned a lot from that airplane. They learned how, first of all, that airplane was really lightweight. I think it weighs like 4,000 pounds or something like that. So a very small, very light aircraft that was designed around the engine that they actually had at the time. They did a lot of research into airfoils, engine inlet, tailpipes. Like it really was the prototype for this airplane, even though they look completely different. But this is what it turned into to actually be a practical airplane. So this evolution of airplane really is existing fighter technology that's been sort of adapted to take jet engines, which are different, right? They're different shape, they're different weight, so you got to move them for center of gravity. You've got to have an inlet in the front, as opposed to kind of being able to put an inlet, air inlet kind of anywhere you want. That inlet's got to be big. You need to get very hot air out the back. Inlets at the time, we can talk about that for a second, or intakes as the British tend to call them, were an unknown science at the time. And you can actually see part of that on this engine here. So this is like a screen that would keep bugs or rocks or whatever out of the engine, which is a good thing. You look at any modern aircraft or any engineer working on intake design, they see this and they just cringe because the airflow through this screen, you get massive flow losses, which really kills a lot of your thrust. I don't know if that was known at the time. Surely it was, but I think they also thought, well, rocks also kill thrust, so we've got to do something here. But it's details like this that really evolved very quickly, and we'll get to the next gen here in a second and see how much different it was. So an airplane like this, it really is just piston engine technology. Straight wing, no sweep. They didn't know really about sweep yet. We'll cover that here in just a second. Airfoils, again, similar to what had already been built. They weren't yet onto, we didn't make airfoils really, really thin on that.
Yeah, because that is quite
right here.
Hefty.
Yeah, you can't, these pointed wingtips, it's hard to see the actual airfoil. But if you back up enough, you might be able to see it. They were starting to get into the direction they needed to. So this aircraft, I think at the tip here, has like a 9% airfoil, which is pretty good. That's a lot thinner than a lot of earlier of the piston engine jets. I think the later Mark Spitfires, I forget which Marks they were, a couple of them had a thinner wing for better supersonic or transonic, I should say, aerodynamics. The other thing, again, I don't know if you'll be able to see it here, but another thing they were starting to figure out is bringing the max thickness point back further delayed transonic drag rise onset a little bit more. Not near as much what a swept wing would do, but it helped. So even in the early 40s, they were starting to get onto some of those principles and understand that. Another big one on the Meteor is when you have jet exhaust coming out the back, it's very hot. I don't know the exact number, probably 1,500 degrees or something. It basically melts anything you have behind it. So now you had to start worrying about where do you put the tail. And that was a big kind of thought process change. Early on in piston engine fighters, you actually wanted as much of the wing as you could get in the prop wash, and for the most case, as much as the tails you can get in the prop wash. Because what that did is that accelerated flow at lower speeds gave you more stall speed and more control authority. So an airplane like a Spitfire or a Mustang, I think has probably something like a 10 knot lower stall speed when they're at power versus when they're gliding. And that's really important in dogfighting because you're trying to fly right on that edge where you're getting max turning performance, but you don't want to stall. And so jets, you lose that, right? There's no prop wash anymore. You do have some jet exhaust. You do not want that flying over any part of your airplane because they cannot withstand that temperature.
Which is something we talked about when we looked at the F4 and...
Yes. Yeah, later on with titanium, you can start to
play around with
it a little bit. You don't want it hanging out there forever. If it briefly gets in there, especially due to a maneuver and all of a sudden that velocity gets deflected a little bit, like they can kind of deal with that. But I don't know of any jet that just blatantly puts a tail in the jet exhaust, especially once you get to afterburner. Like, not going to work. Yeah, so that's the Meteor. For its day, very successful. You know, was operational in World War II, never saw action as a fighter against other crewed aircraft per se. And from what I understand, there's two reasons for that. One is...
Let's quickly go around the front.
Yeah.
And don't look at that, dear.
Yeah, we're
coming back to this. It's my favorite hunter,
this
everybody.
Silly red airplane.
It's an incredible red airplane. So we'll just wander over here. Try not to get too many lovely visitors to Tangmere on that.
Yeah, so this aircraft, the Meteor, was operational during World War II. I don't think it ever saw combat against other crewed aircraft, primarily for two reasons. One is these early jets were really, really fuel hungry. No such thing as aerial refueling at the time, and they didn't have much range. So getting them over to Germany, especially deep in Germany, just was not a possibility. Secondly, I think, especially early on, there was a strong sentiment to not let one of these get shot down and fall into German hands. So I think that kind of kept them to channel defense and that sort of thing.
I think one wing did make it over before the end, but I don't think it saw any sort of proper air-to-air.
Yeah. Now, the one thing it did do, one of its claims to fame, is it was the first jet-on-jet shoot-down, not on a crewed aircraft, but on a V1. So the Meteors were great. They could actually, in level flight at low altitude, have a faster speed than a V1. And so they could actually catch V1s. Now, at the time, the V1s were operating as a very narrow window of time, like a 3-month period. There weren't many of these operational, so they ended up not getting many kills. I think it was something like a dozen. But they were quite good at that. And had there been more of them, I think they would have racked up a lot of kills just due to its speed at low altitude.
We can see the inlet reasonably well. And this is where I realize I've not put my filter on the end of this. So, but what hopefully you can see, you can see us. Hello, everybody. I'll take a picture of that. Is you can see the wing spar going straight through the
yes,
intake.
I meant to mention that. So again, we were talking about there's big configuration changes that are starting to come about on these aircraft as opposed to a propeller aircraft. A piston engine, obviously, you can stick that engine in front of the wing if you have a twin, on top of the wing, underneath the wing. You don't really care. You know, the structure can go behind it because you got this big propeller out front. A jet, by definition, all of the airflow is going through the engine, right? So if you do a configuration like this, where you want this thing kind of centered on the wing, now you've got an engine, you've got wing spars that basically have to coexist, or they have to go around it. And in this case, you can see that wing leading edge in there. The front spar of this wing actually does sit right in front of the engine. I believe the rear spar does have what's called a ring frame that actually goes around the engine, much like the de Havilland Comet was built later, is famous for that.
Which I suppose with the centrifugal engine, you have the ability, because you're taking the air from around as opposed to through with an axial flow.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get over to the axial flow engines. This is obviously a different layout than an ME-262. The overall configuration of the two aircraft is actually not that different. The big difference is the 262 did use an axial flow engine. The Germans were slightly ahead of the Brits on the axial flow compressor design, so they went to that. Much smaller engine. I think the entire diameter of a ME-262 Jumo engine is probably not much bigger than this inlet. And so when it's that, you can see how much larger this nacelle gets as it goes back. So when it's only this big, you can put it underneath the wing, which from a structural standpoint is a way better answer. But this thing is so big, it just doesn't work. They also didn't want this inlet this far off the ground, sucking up gravel and stuff, even though they had those screens in there. But, but still, yeah. One other interesting point of the Meteor that I never really knew about, there was an experimental version of the Meteor that actually was the very first aircraft in the world to ever fly as a turboprop. So that's taking a jet engine, putting a gearbox on the front, an extra power turbine in the back to power it, and then a big propeller. I forget what the prototype number was called, nor I don't remember the engine either. But there's a picture out there of this airplane with two big propellers on it. That is the very first turboprop. So at the same time, they were experimenting with, hey, is a turboprop a better solution here? And for takeoff distance, it is, but for high-speed performance, it's no better than a piston. So
of course, if you haven't watched our little tour of the museum here, this is the E549, which of course set the world speed record in 1946. So this aircraft is in immaculate condition, really, and a great example of a Meteor. Where do we go now?
Well, so let me double click on that real quick. So we're going to talk about speed records here quite a bit more in the next couple of aircraft we talk about. This was one of the first to kick off what I informally call like the golden age of jet speed records. So there was a time after this for, I forget how long it went, probably 5 or 6 years, where there was a lot of speed records set. Basically somebody at some company, it could have been Gloster first, figured out, oh, hey, there's marketing gold here. So almost every aircraft manufacturer during this upcoming phase figured out, how do we hot rod our model and go take the speed record. And a lot of times those speed records held for like a couple weeks before someone else went and did it again. But this was kind of like one of the first. Actually, I should take that back. The Germans tried to do it first, but because of them being Nazis, they weren't official records. So they're not actually in the record book.
They don't count.
Exactly. But yeah, so then it was kind of back and forth between the Brits and the Americans, and almost all of the Century series ended up there at one point. All the airplanes in this half of the room ended up there. The Lightning had it at one point. So kind of a fascinating story.
Yeah. And of course, if you're saying, well, hang on, 1946, Jaeger's about to spread out, it's aircraft that take off under their own power, set the speed record, and land on their own landing gear as opposed to being dropped as an experiment. It's slightly different, but
yeah, absolutely.
That's where we get super geeky about land speed records. Sorry, world air speed record. Yeah. The land speed record's something entirely different.
So why don't we go then catch up another couple years later. Let's talk about axial flow engines, and then we can start talking about these next two generation of aircraft.
Super, let's go.
All right, so before we move on to talking about the Generation 2 jets, I want to do a quick shout out to the Vampire so that nobody accuses us of calling it uninteresting, because it's far from. So the Vampire is 2 buildings over in their restoration hangar. Unfortunately, it's not very accessible at the moment. They're hoping to change that here at Tangmere very soon. This is a beautiful airplane. It's been fully restored. Fascinating airplane, just like the Meteor. And it's a perfect example of wait a year or two, and all of a sudden you get brand new Christmas presents and jets that might have twice the thrust that you just had. And so, like we said on the Meteor, you really couldn't do that airplane practically as a twin. Once you get to the Vampire, you can totally, or sorry, as a single. The Vampire you can totally do as a single engine aircraft. Similar performance to the Meteor, but much smaller, much lighter, just a much more efficient airplane, for lack of a better term. So one of the things that it has in common with the Meteor, that because we were talking about efficiency of these jets, intake efficiency is important, tailpipe efficiency is important. So there was an early idea of, well, let's just stick these jets in the middle of the fuselage and just, so keep the kind of same format as the original piston engine aircraft and just put a long tailpipe through it. Unfortunately, the airflow coming out of these jets is so fast, you get a lot of loss the longer that tailpipe gets. And on these first gen engines, you could afford no losses. And so that's why the Meteor has the potted engines with a very short tailpipe after the engine. Vampire is the same way. So the Vampire has the potted configuration where the fuselage engine at the back is relatively short, so there's virtually no tailpipe, and then twin booms to get around that. So, so a great design for the era. You quickly get away from that, which we'll talk about in a second. But at that time, when the engine thrust was still absolutely critical, it was a great design compromise. Couple of things on the Vampire, and again, it's hard to show it in where it's currently being stored. The engine inlet, if you look at it, is interesting. It's quite small. It literally is like this big. And there's 2 of them, so you get double that area, but it's only feeding 1 engine. So if you kind of compare the size of that to what we just saw in the Meteor, just everything about that airplane is kind of like a shrunk down Meteor in a way.
The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection, like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777 and the second prototype 787 Dreamliner. Whether you're a military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the Aviation Show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its 3rd year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better because the Philippine Mars is now on display, and right across the car park, the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum's doors are wide open to welcome you in to check out an amazing collection of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and other vehicles if you get fed up with all the airplanes. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing.
We were also talking about airfoils. That one, you can see, has a similar airfoil I was just talking about. It's relatively thin, not like incredibly thin, but something like 9% again. And this max thickness is relatively far back. So again, it's a pretty good transonic airfoil for the time. It's about as good as you can get before you start sweeping wings, which we're about to talk about.
Yes, and very difficult to sweep wings when you're making the thing out of wood.
Yes, yeah. The Vampire is half made out of wood as well,
yeah.
Which is also fascinating. Again, it's very resourceful for its time. Again, built in the middle of the war.
Yep.
So before we get deep into this fabulous airplane, let's talk about engine technology change for just a bit. So this is a Bristol Orpheus, I believe, and we're using this as an example because it's quite accessible here. Behind it is a Avon, which is what would be in the Hunter. Similar engines, and I'm sure I'll catch a lot of flack for that from the engine guys, but in that they're similar in that they're axial flow compressor engines. And so this is a really big leap forward in jet engine technology, and it's really what makes these next generation of jets possible. So what that means, instead of that centrifugal compressor that we were just looking at, this has a whole series of rotating compressor sections with lots of little tiny blades, followed by a stator section that looks kind of similar, but it doesn't spin. And each time you go through one of those sections, it compresses the air a little bit. Well, I should say it accelerates the air a little bit with the rotor, and then it goes through the stator, which turns that velocity into pressure. And each one of those is like right on the edge of barely working, because the aerodynamics in these is very tricky. But that's why you have it, each of those stages do just a little bit of compression, and then you put a whole bunch of them in a row. And I don't know, this engine probably has 6 or 8 rows. Later, much later engines will sometimes have 15 or 20 rows of compressors. So basically, as the materials got better and the technology increased, you could just keep doing that. But each of those stages also greatly increases the temperature of the air, and with original materials, there was a limit to how far you could push that. So great technology. You can see this engine. Actually, I don't know what this engine puts out. So let's talk about the Avon for a second. The Avon started as something like a 5,000-pound thrust engine. I think the later versions got much higher than that. And it's just for the amount of thrust, it's a much smaller engine than the original centrifugal compressor engines. So you could basically make the whole aircraft smaller. An early version of the Hunter, a prototype before it was called the Hunter, actually flew with some of the old, centrifugal engines. And I think when they switched the Avon, they were able to bring the diameter of the airplane down by something like a foot, which doesn't sound like a lot when an aircraft is this big, but it makes a huge difference for supersonic aero. Mm-hmm. So the biggest downside of this engine, or this class of engine, I should say, not this one specifically, which was really not known at the time, but it was starting to be learned practically, is what's called flow distortion. So on that type of an engine, the centrifugal, you can almost give it any kind of airflow you want, any kind of losses. It can be asymmetric, it doesn't care, because once it gets into that inlet ring, the way they fling the air out, it's gonna work no matter what. These are a lot more finicky. So you see all those row of turbine blades in there as they spin. If the airflow is not very uniform coming into them, the air will actually stall. So those are like little airplane wings in themselves. And if they stall, what happens is all of a sudden it disrupts the entire airflow through the front of the engine. All of a sudden, it's not doing the work it's supposed to do. Momentarily, there's still a lot going on in the back of the engine. It's still trying to power the front, and without it doing anything, there's no work being done. So then what happens is the engine does what's called a surge, which means it instantaneously just like runs away on speed before either the control system can shut it down or the thing literally explodes. And it's a very quick thing, and these early engines were very prone to that. Not really per se because of the engine, but because of the complicated and somewhat nasty airflow that were being put into these engines. So later engines, later jet engine designs, 10, 20 years later, tended to start having what's called a distortion tolerant fan, which is more margin on the aerodynamics so they could better deal with that. And then more importantly, a lot more attention was put into intakes to get more uniform air into them. But again, at this era, it was just barely known. So a lot of the engine inlets you see, the bifurcated ducts and things like that, they're notorious for, if you all of a sudden you start yawing, maybe this inlet on one side feeds this side very nicely, but on the other sside it doesn't. And all of a sudden it can start, stalling over there, and then that rotates around what's called a rotating stall, and it just wreaks havoc on these engines.
Because again, like when we were speaking about aerodynamics last time, I think you're wanting I'm waving my hand now. Yeah. You're wanting your airflow to almost be at 90 degrees to the surface. Yes. That it's going to be interacting. So if you're bending it, yep, kind of like we'll talk about on the Hunter, yep, F105 as well, with the inlets coming through onto the single engine as well. As soon as you sort of bend it or turn it, yeah, you're making it indices that could cause you problems in certain attitudes.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's another effect that often would happen, and that is, if you've got even a slight imbalance, left, right, up, down, whatever, not enough to stall those blades and surge the engine, but a slight imbalance, as these blades are rotating around, now as they come around, they're getting like really good air and really bad air, and then really good air. And that actually like flexes the blades and can cause harmonics to where those blades will fatigue, or it'll cause flutter in the blades. It can do that as well. And so a lot of early engine, just all of a sudden, oh yeah, the engine didn't survive, right? Like it just blew up after 10 hours or something. Those little details, even though it might have ran for hundreds of hours in a test cell, those details on the inlet make a big difference on how the engine performs in the aircraft. So let's walk around front and talk about the Hunter.
Yes. We may have mentioned my love for the Hunter many, many, many times on this show. But ladies and gentlemen, this here is my favorite Hunter in the world.
Yes.
Because we have one airspeed record aircraft in the Meteor, and this is Neville Duke's airspeed record aircraft from 1951,
I think.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So what we'll do is we'll just come to the front. We'll look down here, because it's too beautiful not to. It looks even better in red. And other than a few little bits and pieces, this is a Mark F3. It's essentially a Mark F1. So we can talk about it as an F1.
Right.
And then we can talk about the cool, massive reheated engine that they put on it to get it up to speed.
Exactly. So before we dig into that, let's go backwards just a second and talk about generations again. So now we're really talking about second generation jets, again, if you go by the Havilland nomenclature. And so what the big change on second generation was swept wings. That in itself is a fascinating story. So this era of British jets, I think, gets a lot of flack at times, with the criticism being they were too late. And that's somewhat of a fair criticism, because they, in a lot of ways, were. It's nothing to take away how great of airplanes they were, but they did come on late compared to some of their competitors. So this airplane, performance-wise, is very similar to an F-86 and very similar to a MiG-15, but it came out 2 years later. Actually, it flew a year later than an F-86. I think it came into service 4 years later. So there's a big lag in there that could have made more of a difference had it been out earlier. And there's
we'll just point out that this aircraft sold incredibly well
all
around the world.
Absolutely.
So
and again,
I'm going to be defending this one quite a bit.
As you should. And
we'll argue
really
about the Lightning in a minute.
Trying to be negative on any of these aircraft, because I'm a big fan of all of them. So let's talk a little bit about why they were late, right? It is not just, oh, the silly Brits were sitting on their hands or at the pub too long or whatever. Like there's some very specific things going on that probably was inevitable, that these airplanes were going to be late. So first of all, America and Russia, for that matter, were just in a very different state as countries right after World War II. So these aircraft, they kind of had their origin story right at the end of the war, but they really picked up steam after the war. That's where most of the development, that's when the engines, the updated engines finally became available. So this really is a post-war aircraft. Great Britain was just a different country after the war. Like, you guys have been bombed, like, significantly. There was a lot of rebuilding to do. All of the industry was dispersed in all these little satellite factories. So, like, the teams weren't as cohesive as they could have been. Or I should say, as like some of the teams in America and Russia were. And there's, like, you shouldn't underestimate how much impact things like that have. The other one that I think is a fascinating story, and I'll absolutely, as an American, take the blame for this one. So let's talk about swept wings for a second. So we talked about this a lot in the Century series, so I'll just recap that very briefly. So you can put a top view of this in the video. But so this aircraft, the wing leading edge, is swept back at something like 40 degrees. I don't remember the exact number, but it's significant. That is a really important effect for pushing the transonic drag rise that you get on all aircraft up to a much higher level. So without this, aircraft don't really like to fly above about Mach 0.8-ish, maybe 0.85. With that, just changing that wing sweep, you can push that up to right at the edge of supersonic. And with enough thrust and or enough of a dive, you can absolutely go supersonic. So this era of airplane, the second generation, so the Hunter, the Swift, which we'll talk about in a second, F-86, MiG-15, all capitalize on that. Where that idea came from was from the Germans. So the Germans actually published a paper before the war. This was all out in the public domain. nobody bothered to find that. And so where this really came and got cemented was on, I forget the exact date, but it was April 1945. Allied forces came across an experimental area in Germany outside of Braunschweig. And the facility was called the LFA, which is some German word this long. That essentially was the German Research Institute, Aero Research Institute. It was an institute that had a whole bunch of wind tunnels, including supersonic wind tunnels, and it's where all of the leading German aerodynamicists were working at the time. So the Allies run across this, buried in the woods. The Allies, the boffins and intelligence people, theoretically knew of that this site probably existed somewhere. They had no idea where until some GIs stumbled across it. So word got back. Before this, there was a meeting, a joint meeting between the British and the Americans, basically come up with an agreement of, hey, we're about to, uncover a lot of interesting stuff in Germany, scientific stuff. Let's all agree to share whatever we find. Let's not hoard it, right? So America brought a team, a big team, I think something like 50 people, led by Theodor von Karman, the famous aerodynamicist. And he was on site by May 7th, so less than a month later, before the war was even over. They were in this facility, poring over this data, boxing up models, et cetera. This agreement said everything we find is going to be cataloged and shared and so forth. Well, us dirty Americans, the British, it was in the British zone of occupation, so they were guarding the camp, right, to make sure it wasn't looted and so forth. At the night, the Americans would come in, grab more documents, and get them home, thinking, we don't have time for this, we've got to get this information home. With the intention of we'll share it eventually, and they did, but that's the problem, is eventually.
Eventually, yeah.
So George Schreier, who was one of the lead aerodynamicists at Boeing, was working on the B-47 at the time. He actually wrote a memo that you can find scans of online, back home to his team on May 10th, right, 2 days after the war's over, detailing all this stuff he had found, like hand sketches of swept wings and why it worked and so forth, then sent all the documents home. We just went on a boat and got there a month later. But that team on the B-47 switched to a swept wing design within like days of this. Same thing on the F-86.
There's a fantastic film. It's the pilot training video for the B-47. They talk about that and how wrong they were getting. The airplane was not working until they got that data. And then it went racing ahead and still became a very tricky aircraft to fly. But
for sure. Yeah, there was still a lot of learning to be done. But so both of those aircraft, the F-86 and the B-47, which were the first aircraft to have a swept wing outside of Germany. And I could actually argue almost the first real swept wing. So the Me-262 had a swept wing, kind of, but it was like 20 degrees, which helps a little, but it doesn't get you what this wing gets you. So again, I'll throw my fellow Americans under the bus. They broke the rules, right, for their own advantage. And I honestly think that probably set this airplane back at least probably 6 months, if not more. I've not yet been able to find a date when that data actually did get shared with the Brits, but I don't think it was anytime soon. So then fast forward 6 weeks, the British sent a team in there as well. Two problems with that team. One is it was led by Sir Roy Fedden, I'm a huge fan of. That's not the problem. The problem is he was focused on the wrong things. So Roy was an engine guy, right? Designer of the Jupiter, pioneer of sleeve valves, amazing guy. Yeah. He was working for the Ministry of Aircraft Production at the time. He's an engine guy. He's out looking for engine secrets. So he has a top 5 things I'm trying to find. It was stuff on fuel technology, turbochargers, propeller automatic speed limiters, and stuff like that, right? Like, talk about wrong focus for the time. But again, how are you going to know that? Anyway, so
Fedden was there after his incredible bust up with everybody at Bristol's, but that's another story for another time.
Yeah. And so that was problem number one. Problem number two, there wasn't much left to see because Americans had already taken it all. So, yeah. But anyway, I digress.
That was good digression. Well done, man.
Yeah, those are some of the I think factual pieces that lead up to both of these aircranes of Swift we'll get to in a minute being behind, right? But again, wasn't going to let the Brits down. Keep at it, and man, you get a fabulous airplane in the end.
Be sure to join us for part 2 as we continue our look at these great 1950s British jet fighters. As we delve further into the Hunter, we look at the Supermarine Swift, and of course we can't leave out the mighty English Electric Lightning. Be sure to like and subscribe so as you don't miss it when the episode goes live. And until next time, bye-bye. I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun from just £3 a month plus a bit of VAT, get your name in these very credits, and get all the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished. The Aviation Show is hosted and produced by Matt Bone and is a Boney Abroad production.